Welcome to the Peak of Geek, where we've hit the top but with no plans to stop. When I was growing up in the 90s, you were traditionally a Nintendo kid or a Sega kid. Usually, my family ended up going with the Nintendo consoles with the odd rare exception. And when it came time to buy a new console in the mid-90s, we opted for the Nintendo 64. But one of my friends decided to go the Sony route and took a gamble on the brand new PlayStation. Even back then, I knew this was a more adult game system, and something I was always curious about. My PlayStation friend and I would occasionally trade systems for a weekend or two, and I remember distinct moments of awe while playing Crash Bandicoot and Twisted Metal 2. For the most part, I was happy with the Nintendo 64, but when a certain game came along for the PlayStation with graphics that looked like something out of a future I couldn't even begin to imagine, I was more than a little jealous. This was my introduction to Final Fantasy VII. I have so many memories of having sleepovers with that PlayStation friend so we could embark on this RPG adventure together. I was mostly there to watch, but sometimes I would be allowed to play, and I can still remember the stress of making sure I didn't get us killed during the battles. Every choice felt incredibly important, and so far I was doing well and not letting the team down. But then, at some point during our shared playthrough, disaster struck. And by disaster, I mean me. I was the disaster. I don't remember exactly how it happened, but at some point during an exciting moment of gameplay, I accidentally bumped the PlayStation, and something terrible happened to the memory card. Our progress was gone. Fortunately, we had the foresight to save in multiple save slots, but we hadn't used slot 2 in a long time. Over 5 hours was lost. My friend was rightfully upset, and he ended up going to sleep. But I stayed awake and did what any good friend would do. I forced myself to stay up most of the night, getting us back to where we were in the story. I remember passing out as the sun rose, but by the time I woke up in the early afternoon, all was forgiven. But my friend ultimately decided to play the rest of the game alone. The team was broken, and he never wanted to trade systems again because, as he put it, I've played everything I cared about on Nintendo 64. I mean, he did have a point. There were definitely periods throughout the system's lifespan where nothing all that memorable released on those bulky cartridges. And while I was disappointed that I never got to see the rest of the story in Final Fantasy VII, I wouldn't have to wait for long. By the next summer, Final Fantasy VII would see release on PC. Now I had another friend who had an older brother who had the game, so I managed to get my own. And I've since rebought the game several times over the years. And that was how I finally got to play Final Fantasy VII for myself. That's also how I got to play Final Fantasy VIII when that one also saw a release on PC a few years later, which I proudly purchased with my own cash money. Am I upset that Final Fantasy IX, which would go on to become my favorite of the entire franchise, never saw a PC release at the time? Yes. Yes, I am. Fortunately, the PlayStation 2 was only a few months away at the time, so I happily bought myself a copy of Part 9 to play once I said so long to Nintendo consoles for now. And while Part 9 is peak turn-based Final Fantasy to me, this is not the place to gush over that one. Because Part 7 was absolutely my gateway to technologically impressive, long-running stories. And this game is still quite special to me. Back when I first played Final Fantasy VII on my own, I wasn't even a teenager yet. I was still getting accustomed to 3D games, let alone complex narratives. So Cloud's story absolutely went over my head. But for me, it was all about the more adult-oriented story than I was used to, complete with swears that I definitely wasn't allowed to say out loud. And the gloriously detailed background art and the incredible music score all contributed to this strange cyberpunk future that I could barely understand but loved all the same. At the time, it felt like I was experiencing the cutting edge of graphics and storytelling, and there were definite moments where it took my breath away. Since I was young and inexperienced, I didn't get very far in Final Fantasy VII. Once I got to the overworld after Midgar, I felt lost and overwhelmed. So much so that I ended up restarting the game to see if I had missed something along the way. In other words, I became very familiar with that initial Midgar section. I explored every inch of the slums. I tracked down every person I could talk to, tried to find and fight every monster, and just wanted to virtually exist in that strange world. Every song during those first few hours in Midgar has the magical ability to transport me back to my childhood. Executing each reactor mission, falling down to the Sector 5 slums to find Aerith and Reno, sitting on top of that weird tongue-faced slide with Aerith, exploring Wall Market and all its weirdness, climbing to the top of the plate using the batteries, and that moment when you wake up to see a trail of blood in the Shinra building. The mystery and intrigue build up perfectly, and it all felt like I was a part of something bigger that I couldn't quite understand. I didn't care that the character models were a bit crude compared to other games I was playing at the time, because the intricately drawn backgrounds and my young imagination easily filled in the blanks. I never did finish Final Fantasy VII when I was a kid. I remember getting to Junon, and then getting stuck and not being able to beat Genova on the ship to Costa del Sol. I finally did roll credits a few years later on PlayStation 2, and while I did enjoy the rest of the game, those Midgar memories will always be my most powerful ones. So now, let's flash forward 15 years later when a huge gaming announcement would stun the world. Myself included. The long-awaited Final Fantasy VII Remake was not only coming, but we soon learned that it would be split into parts, with Part 1 only covering that first Midgar section. I was overjoyed. Since that was the part of the game I played the most growing up, Midgar kind of represented Final Fantasy VII to me. That amazingly detailed world I spent so much time in as a child would be completely remade? Bring it on! Final Fantasy VII Remake is something truly special, especially for those who played the original way back when. When it finally released, 5 years after that initial announcement, the hype was out of this world. As soon as I picked up the controller and watched that opening cinematic, I knew this was one of those rare, highly anticipated games for me where I absolutely needed to explore every inch of this world. I wanted to see every poster, every sign, and talk to every person until they stopped saying unique things. I immediately turned on the subtitles for the NPCs you couldn't directly talk to, since they still had spoken dialogue that went a long way towards fleshing out the world and the people living in it. It was mind-boggling how much depth the developers put into this remake. While I thought the original was impressively detailed, it has nothing on this reimagining of Sector 7, Sector 5, the Wall Market, the Shinra building, and every other nuanced area in between. This time around, it's as if the world really was alive. I remember reading an article when Remake first released that said something like, "Playing Remake makes the original feel underdeveloped in retrospect." And while I don't exactly agree, I see what they're saying. Your mind and imagination definitely filled in the gaps back then. Whether that was visual detail when it came to the blocky character models, or environmental detail and character backstory or motivations based on the in-game dialogue. Don't get me wrong, there was lots of it, but as was typical for other RPGs at the time, many of these interactions only provided exposition dumps for the player, especially when it came to the side characters. But let's get the elephant out of the room since we've sort of been dancing around it for a while. Yes, Final Fantasy VII expands on just about everything. And sometimes it is to the detriment of the player experience. By this, I mean the sections that feel a little padded. Now, while some may disagree, I don't think anything to do with the characters or the story were expanded upon unnecessarily. I love almost everything new that gave us more detail about Midgar and its inhabitants. But where it started to annoy me is in some of the dungeon design. Specifically, the mechanical arm puzzles with Aerith, and that part where you have to turn on the lights when raiding the Shinra building. Some of those sequences went on a bit too long for my taste. However, every other addition, especially the expansion of characters through the many optional side quests found all throughout, were fantastic. Not every side quest was 10 out of 10 gameplay-wise, but the extra lore and character moments made them all worth experiencing. Especially characters like Jessie, Wedge, and to a lesser degree Biggs, who looks and sounds just like a young Charlie Sheen. I guarantee, once you see it, you'll never unsee it. Anyway, they all completely outshine the original game in every conceivable way. This game made me love these characters, especially my cat-loving boy Wedge. Other elements that weren't in the original, like the new battles with Roach, the motorcycling maniac, and the honeybee dance sequence, are easily some of my favorites. But hey, I'm a sucker for over-the-top exaggerated characters and gameplay sequences. I'm one of those who unabashedly loved Advent Children and that motorcycle fight because it was ridiculous, but amazing. Obeying the laws of gravity is for losers. Here's hoping you have a phoenix down, Cloud. The only new character who felt a bit uninspired to me was Chadley, the one who gives you materia and summons for participating in virtual battles in his combat simulator. I've always sort of hated these types of battles in games. There's nothing fun for me about fighting enemies, usually ones you fought before, but now in a strange virtual reality void environment. Chadley also straight up gives me the creeps. Dude never blinks. The main characters are understandably given the biggest glow-ups. Everyone's motivations and personality traits are greatly expanded upon, so much so that they actually feel like real, relatable people. Even though it's still early days for Cloud, the slow process of him becoming less stiff and cold towards others is explored well here. When comparing his early game reactions and responses to the ones towards the end of the game, you see actual growth and emotional maturity, but he still has a long way to go. Similarly, Barrett, Tifa, and Aerith are all given more dimensionality to their thoughts and feelings. Barrett isn't just a gruff but passionate leader who's quick to anger. Tifa isn't just a confused but kind people pleaser vying for Cloud's attention. And Aerith isn't just a mysterious sheltered small town girl trying to do the same. They're all given the much needed space to express themselves and form more meaningful relationships with one another. For me, the best examples of this are in Cloud and Tifa's relationship and Tifa and Aerith's relationship. In the original game, it felt like Tifa and Aerith were only really competing for Cloud's affections, but in this version of events, they start to build a natural friendship, and it's quite beautiful. And even though you encounter Red 13 near the end of the game, and he only joins your party as a temporary character, there is also something intriguing there in the way he methodically interacts with the party, and starts planting seeds towards building a great relationship with Barrett. Arguably, the most controversial character expansion is Sephiroth. I won't go into much detail here, I'll just say he is in this game, that much you can tell from the trailers, and while some may call his inclusion unnecessary, I disagree. Since he plays a more prominent role in this version of the story, it only makes sense for him to inject more foreshadowing even earlier into Cloud's journey. The mysterious entity version of Sephiroth's character from the original Final Fantasy VII wouldn't work in a remake anyway, since we're all living in a world where he's so widely recognized to the point where he's a playable character in Super Smash Bros. So I applaud the developers for adding a new layer of mystery for new and old fans by introducing him earlier, and so much more. As a 90s kid, I grew up on turn-based RPGs, and along with Final Fantasy, I count games like Earthbound, Paper Mario, and the Lunar series amongst my favorites. But I also love action-oriented RPGs, like Kingdom Hearts and the Ys series. And Final Fantasy VII Remake stands as the perfect combination between the classic FF7 turn-based battles and the frantic button mashing found in Kingdom Hearts. And it surprises me to say we actually have Final Fantasy XIII to thank for this, since a version of the stagger battle system was originally introduced back then. It's since been refined here and works very well with the action parts of the combat, since you'll press buttons to attack and dodge while your ATB meter fills. Then you can pull off a special ability or a magic spell to exploit the enemy's weakness, switch to another party member in between, and continue to mix it up. There's also a gameplay setting for players to focus only on ATB attacks, but this frenetic switching of characters is so much fun and feels like a logical step up from the original. As of the filming of this video, the Final Fantasy VII Remake project isn't finished yet. Remake is a few years old, Rebirth is brand new, and Reborn isn't even out yet. I mean, I want to call it Reunion, but they already used that name for the Crisis Core remake, so I don't know. Re-something anyway. Either way, it feels weird to celebrate a game that's both unfinished and also ends on such an ambitious note. If you know, you know. And if you don't, I'll just say you might want to play the original FF7 before you play the remake. It'll make a lot more sense that way. And you know what? This might be the only remake ever that manages to give the original even more of a purpose. And when you think about it, that's kind of amazing. I also like to think we've since learned that technology is a great support piece to help tell a realistic story, but gameplay should always come first. While it was the graphics and technology that managed to create the world that originally lured me in as a kid, thankfully there was a lot more going on. I think it's important to realize that Final Fantasy VII on the PlayStation 1 was an early champion for disc-based experiences and early computer-generated imagery, but without the engaging story and fun gameplay, it would not have stood the test of time. And personally, I think Final Fantasy VII Remake is a fantastic testament to that legacy, while still finding new and exciting ways to expand on the world and its characters. It absolutely changes things up so it can still surprise and delight both newcomers and diehard fans alike. But at the same time, when something is so important to people, like the original Final Fantasy VII, I totally understand why there's also some disappointment regarding the remake. For some, it may not have gone in the direction they would have preferred. But what we have is absolutely beautiful, and stands as one of the greatest games I've ever played, right alongside the original. But what about you? What are some of your Final Fantasy VII memories? What other games bring you back to the past? Did you play and enjoy Remake? Let me know all about it down in the comments below, and until next time, I have to know. Did anybody else ever softlock themselves out of Final Fantasy VIII? I didn't really understand the junction system as a kid, and I just used my Guardian forces for every battle in the game. Until I got to that one battle when I couldn't, and whoops, game over. These are some of the meaningless regrets I often think about. Hey, hope you're having a super awesome day. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like, comment, and subscribe. Thank you so much, and I'll see you real soon.